Rikers Island, a brutal reality hidden from the public. The night the inmates took control. It was 2:47 a.m. when the chaos began. Inside Rikers Island's notorious C block, the power went out for just 9 seconds, but that was all it took. In those 9 seconds, fists flew, shanks flashed, and guards ran for cover. An inmate known as Tone, a tall man with teardrop tattoos under both eyes, slammed another prisoner against the bars, yelling, "No more hiding. Tonight they'll see what Rikers really is." When the emergency lights flickered back on, the hallway was painted in red, blood, not paint. A guard's radio crackled uselessly as screams echoed down the corridor. And while officers scrambled to lock down the unit, something far worse was unfolding in the shadows of that overcrowded cell block. Because what started as a fight was really a message from the inside, meant to expose a brutal truth the public was never supposed to see. What pushed these men to the edge? What reality could be so dark that they'd rather risk dying than keep silent? The island nobody escapes. Sound, ocean waves, the faint hum of city traffic, and a distant helicopter. Rikers Island sits between Queens and the Bronx, surrounded by the East River. From the sky, it looks like just another correctional facility, rows of gray buildings, guard towers, fences wrapped in razor wire. But to the thousands trapped inside, it's not just a jail, it's a world cut off from mercy. They call it the Forgotten Island. Even though it's just a few miles from Manhattan's bright skyline, the suffering inside feels a million miles away. Overcrowded cells, rotten food, no medical help for days. And the guards? Some are just as broken as the inmates they control. Tone, the same inmate who led that midnight riot, arrived here at just 19 years old. He was sentenced for armed robbery, a dumb mistake that spiraled out of control. But Rikers changed him. He entered scared and skinny. He became silent, paranoid, and carved his first tattoo with a sharpened toothbrush. The word, trust, slashed across his arm, crossed out with a single line. Every day, fights broke out. Sometimes over food, sometimes over pride. There was a saying among the inmates, "You don't do time in Rikers. Rikers does time in you." The smell of mold, sweat, and fear clung to every corner. The noise never stopped, yelling, slamming, laughter that wasn't really laughter. Even the guards looked haunted, as if they were prisoners too. But beneath all that, under the noise, the filth, the anger, something darker brewed. A quiet rage. A feeling that nobody on the outside cared. Then one night, that rage erupted. Tone's cellmate, a 17-year-old named Rico, was found unconscious. He had begged for medical help for 2 days after being jumped in the showers. The staff ignored him. When Rico died, the whole block went silent. For 30 seconds, you could hear nothing but the buzz of a fluorescent light. And then, as if the island itself snapped, the silence broke, violently. The spark that lit the riot. It started with one shout. Tone slammed his tray to the floor and yelled, "They don't care about us. Not one of us." Inmates began pounding on their doors, bam, 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 a rhythm of anger. Within minutes, the noise spread across the corridor like wildfire. Dozens of prisoners shouted in unison. Someone broke a broomstick and used it to jam a door shut. The alarms went off. Guards scrambled. From the tower above, an officer radioed for backup. "Control, we've got a disturbance in C block." Multiple inmates unrestrained. But by then it was too late. The cameras went dark. The generator failed. And when the emergency lights flickered back on, the inmates were already free from their cells, not because they escaped, but because someone inside let them out. Rumors would later swirl that a corrupt guard had unlocked the doors for money. Others claimed it was an inside protest, a desperate cry to expose what Rikers really had become, a place where brutality wasn't the exception, it was the routine. Tone stood in the middle of the chaos, surrounded by smoke and screams. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't yelling. He just looked around and whispered, "Now they'll see the truth." Outside, the city slept, unaware that the most dangerous jail in America was burning from the inside out. The cover-up. When dawn broke over Rikers Island, the smoke still hung in the air. The riot had lasted less than an hour, but the scars it left would stretch far longer, not just on the inmates, but on the truth itself. Tone was dragged out of his cell, bruised and silent. His knuckles were raw. His face, blank. He didn't resist, didn't speak. He just stared through the guards like they weren't even there. Outside the block, correctional officers stood shoulder to shoulder, breathing heavy. The floor was slick, the walls cracked, and the stench of tear gas still burned everyone's throats. But the chaos wasn't the worst part. What came next was quieter and more dangerous. The blame game. Within hours, officials flooded the island. Commanders in suits walked through the wreckage with clipboards, snapping photos, pointing fingers. Their goal wasn't justice, it was damage control. A captain ordered all surveillance footage pulled immediately. But strangely, large parts of the footage were missing. 9 crucial minutes during the start of the riot, gone. The same 9 minutes when Rico's death had triggered the fury. An officer whispered to another, "If the news gets this, the mayor will have our heads." So they rewrote the story. By lunchtime, the internal report claimed it was a small altercation between inmates. No mention of medical neglect. No mention of doors mysteriously unlocking. No mention of a young man who died begging for help. The truth, once again, was locked away, just like the men who tried to speak it. Tone was thrown into solitary confinement. The box, a concrete room barely wide enough to stretch your arms. 23 hours a day of silence. No window. No clock. Only his heartbeat echoing off the walls. In that silence, he began to plan something that would shake the island again. But before that, another story was unfolding, one the administration didn't see coming. The officer who knew too much. Officer Daniels, a rookie correctional guard just 6 months on the job, had seen everything. He wasn't like the others, not hardened yet. When the riot broke out, he hid in the medical wing, clutching his radio. And when it was over, he saw something that haunted him. A paramedic wheeling out a stretcher covered in a white sheet, and a young hand falling from beneath it, a hand he recognized. It was Rico. Daniels couldn't shake it. He wrote everything down, times, names, and what the reports had accidentally left out. And one night, unable to bear it, he copied the incident logs onto a flash drive and mailed it anonymously to a journalist in Manhattan. Weeks later, the first article appeared online. Inside Rikers, the death that sparked a hidden riot. At first, it barely got noticed. But inside Rikers, word spread fast. Inmates banged on the walls in approval, a sign that someone on the outside was finally listening. Tone smiled for the first time in months. But he also knew this wasn't over. Because now the warden wanted to know who leaked it. And that question would start a hunt inside the prison, one that would turn even deadlier. The retaliation. The next morning, Officer Daniels was pulled from his post. No explanation. No backup. They sent him to D Block, the most dangerous tier on the island, alone. The inmates there were restless, furious, hungry for answers. When Daniels walked through the gate, the silence felt unnatural. Dozens of eyes followed him. A whisper cut through the air, "That's the one who talked." The guards outside didn't move. Daniels reached for his radio. It didn't work. A hand shot through the bars, grabbing his shirt. Another hand followed. Then another. The tear erupted. By the time backup arrived, Daniels was gone, pulled into a cell and beaten unconscious. He survived barely. But the message was clear. Inside Rikers, the truth could get you killed. Later that night, Tone heard the news through the vents of solitary. He sat in the dark, whispering to himself. They can hide the truth, but not forever. He had no idea that those words were being recorded by a microphone hidden in the wall. Because the prison wasn't just covering up violence anymore. They were listening to every whisper, every secret, every plan. And that's when the real nightmare began. The whispers in the walls. In Rikers Island, silence is never just silence. It's a sign that something's coming. After the beating of Officer Daniels, the air in the prison changed. Guards walked faster. Inmates spoke softer. And everyone felt the same invisible weight. Someone was listening. Tone sat in his solitary cell, tracing cracks on the wall with his fingernail. Each day felt like a loop: eat, stare, think, sleep, repeat. But that night, something strange happened. He heard a faint click. Then a whisper. Not from another inmate, from inside the wall. "Yo, they're listening, man. Check behind the vent." Tone froze. He pushed his ear against the concrete, heart pounding. The voice came again, clearer this time. "They got mics in here. They hearing everything we say." For a long minute, Tone said nothing. Then he stood up, ripped the metal vent cover loose, and shined the dim light of his contraband lighter inside. There it was, a tiny black device, wired into the wall. A microphone. Tone felt his stomach drop. It wasn't paranoia anymore. The prison was actually recording the inmates. Every secret plan, every cry for help, every confession. The realization spread like fire through the cells. Inmates started talking in codes, tapping on walls, passing notes through toilet pipes. They called it the ghost line, their underground way to communicate without being heard. And through that line, they began to plan again. But this time, it wasn't a riot. It was exposure. Tone wanted to show the world what was really happening behind the gates: the beatings, the neglect, the suicides that never made the news. He knew it was dangerous. But after what happened to Rico and Daniels, silence wasn't an option anymore. He found a way to smuggle out messages using a janitor who emptied trash from solitary. Small scraps of paper, folded tight and hidden under old wrappers. Each note carried pieces of truth: dates, names, what guards did, who got hurt. And slowly, those notes made their way into the hands of the same journalist who had published the first article. The more she exposed, the angrier the administration became. They tightened searches. They locked down communication. They even transferred inmates suspected of talking. But it was already too late. The story had started spreading online. Fast. And for the first time in years, people outside the island started asking questions. How many inmates have died inside Rikers in the past year? Why are teenage offenders locked with violent adults? Who's covering up the surveillance? The truth was cracking through the walls, just like the sound of those whispers. Then one night, Tone woke up to footsteps outside his cell. 2 guards stopped at his door. They didn't say a word. One unlocked it. The other stepped inside. Tone braced himself. But instead of a beating, they dropped a folder onto the floor. Inside were printed screenshots, messages, letters, and a headline circled in red ink. Rikers Island, the brutal reality hidden from the public. It was the story he'd helped leak. His heart pounded. The headline looked just like a death sentence. The guard leaned in close and whispered, "Congratulations, Tone. You made the front page. Hope it was worth it." The door slammed shut. The lights went out. That night, Tone didn't sleep. He just stared at the wall, wondering how long before someone came back, not with papers, but with something worse. And he was right to wonder. Because somewhere else on the island, a new plan was already forming, one that would silence the truth for good. The inmates weren't the only ones being watched anymore. Now the guards were too. And that was when everything began to spiral completely out of control. When the walls strike back. The next morning, Rikers felt different. The guards walked slower, their radios silent. The tension wasn't just in the air, it was in the walls themselves. The same microphones that once spied on inmates had turned against their own masters. Weeks before, a group of tech contractors had been hired to maintain the prison's new security network. It was supposed to be state-of-the-art surveillance, cameras in every corner, microphones in every hall, sensors tracking every movement. But what the administrators didn't know was that those same devices were quietly storing data to a separate drive, one that didn't belong to Rikers. A systems glitch exposed it. A young IT worker named Marina Lopez, barely 23, discovered a backup folder full of recordings labeled with dates and inmate names. At first, she thought it was routine. But when she listened closer, what she heard chilled her blood: screams, begging, and guards laughing as they turned off cameras before beatings. She downloaded one file and left it running on her computer while she took her break. When she came back, 3 supervisors were standing behind her. They didn't speak. They just told her, "You've heard too much." By the end of the day, Marina was suspended, pending investigation. That night, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. It was Tone's journalist contact, the one leaking stories about Rikers. The message was simple. We know what you found. Don't delete it. They'll come for it first. For the first time, someone outside the walls had undeniable proof, sound and footage of what the public was never meant to hear. Inside Rikers, Tone could feel something changing. The guards were jumpy. Inmates were being transferred at random. Rumors said the city was preparing to renovate the facility, code for shutting down the most dangerous blocks and scattering inmates elsewhere before the truth spread too far. But Tone wasn't done yet. Through the ghost line, he passed one final message. They think they can silence us. Let's make sure they hear us louder. He knew he wouldn't live to see what came next. Still, he wanted one last act of defiance, one that couldn't be erased by fake reports or deleted footage. Late one night, he set his mattress on fire. Not to escape, but to draw attention. As smoke filled the cell and alarms blared, he shouted the names of everyone who had died in Rikers without justice. One by one, until his voice gave out. When firefighters broke down his door, he was unconscious but alive. On the wall behind him, scrawled in soot and blood, were 4 words. Tell them the truth. Outside, the journalist received one last drive from Marina. It contained over 40 hours of leaked audio and video, proof of cover-ups, abuse, and corruption. Within days, the story exploded across national news. Rikers Island, the brutal reality hidden from the public. The headlines shook the country. Protests erupted. Politicians demanded investigations. For the first time, the island's name wasn't whispered, it was shouted on every major network. But inside, the retaliation was swift. Inmates were beaten. Guards vanished. Marina disappeared without a trace. And Tone was transferred to an undisclosed facility. No one ever saw him again. Some say he died in transit. Others claim he's alive, somewhere upstate, in protective custody. But the recordings he helped expose still echo, in courtrooms, documentaries, and the voices of families demanding answers. Rikers Island remains open, for now. Renovated, renamed, repainted. But the truth that leaked from its walls can't be sealed away again. And somewhere, behind concrete and razor wire, another young inmate whispers through the vent. They're listening, so let's make sure they hear everything. The fall of Rikers Island. The storm that followed the leaks was unlike anything New York City had seen in decades. Overnight, Rikers Island went from a name whispered in fear to a symbol shouted in anger. Outside City Hall, thousands gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Rikers," "No more silence," and "Shut it down." Every major news outlet replayed the leaked clips on a loop, muffled screams, guards mocking injured inmates, and the chilling voice of Tone shouting from his cell, "Tell them the truth." The footage spread online, viral across the US, Canada, and the UK. People couldn't believe it. This wasn't a foreign prison. This was happening in the heart of New York City. For years, politicians had called Rikers a temporary solution. But now, under public pressure, those same voices turned defensive. The mayor held a press conference, his tone shaking. He promised full investigations, structural reform, and accountability. But the people had heard promises before. This time, they wanted action. Investigators swarmed the island. They opened old case files, dug through years of missing reports, and questioned officers who once swore silence. Whistleblowers emerged, nurses, cooks, even janitors, each telling the same story. Beatings ignored, suicides falsified, cameras switched off on command. One nurse described how she was forced to mark a dead inmate as stable because the warden didn't want another statistic. Another guard admitted that solitary confinement cells had no working ventilation for weeks during the summer heat. Every testimony peeled back another layer of the nightmare. Meanwhile, the journalist who broke the story, the same one who received Tone's messages, testified before a grand jury. She played the audio in full. The courtroom fell silent as Tone's voice echoed through the speakers. "You can lock our bodies, but not the truth." That recording alone shook the panel. Within months, the first wave of indictments hit. Corrupt officers, supervisors, and even an assistant deputy commissioner were charged. And then, the governor made the announcement that no one believed would ever come. In front of flashing cameras, he declared, "Rikers Island will be shut down. Permanently." The words hit the city like an earthquake. Crowds outside the courthouse erupted in cheers, while inside, victims' families wept. Reporters flooded the island, capturing haunting images, empty tiers, peeling paint, cells still marked with names carved into the walls. But for those who survived, it wasn't closure. It was just the beginning of remembering. Marina's files became public evidence. The recordings were archived as historical proof of systemic abuse. And Tone, or whatever was left of him, became a legend whispered among inmates across America. To them, he wasn't a hero or a criminal. He was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when a place meant for justice becomes a machine for suffering. In the final months before Rikers closed its gates for good, crews began demolishing parts of the complex. Concrete walls came down, one by one, releasing decades of trapped echoes. The demolition team reported strange moments, radios turning on by themselves, voices faintly coming through the static. One worker swore he heard a whisper through his headset. "They're listening." Whether it was imagination or something deeper, no one could say. But the legend of Rikers didn't die with the walls. It spread into documentaries, classrooms, podcasts, and protests. The island that once silenced thousands now spoke louder than ever. And though it was gone from the map, its shadow still stretched over the justice system, a warning carved in stone and memory. When truth is buried behind bars, it always finds a way to escape. Echoes after the fall. The fences still glint under the sun, but the towers are empty, the gates locked. Grass grows between cracked walkways once stained with blood and tears. It's hard to imagine that this place once held over 10,000 people, each with a story that never made the headlines. From the air, it looks peaceful. But up close, the silence feels heavy, like the walls remember. Years have passed since the government shut it down. The city promised to replace it with smaller, humane facilities spread across the boroughs. But for those who lived through Rikers, there's nothing humane about what came after. Former inmates now live scattered across the country, some rebuilding, some still running from the ghosts that followed them. Tone's name became something whispered in prison yards nationwide. To the inmates, he was more than a man. He was a symbol, proof that even the forgotten could be heard. There's a mural of him now in the Bronx. It shows his face half hidden by shadows, with the words, "Tell them the truth," painted across the wall. Kids walk by it every day, not knowing the full story, only that he was someone who tried to speak when no one else would. And the journalist who exposed everything? She never stopped. Her documentary, Inside Rikers, Voices from the Island, won international awards, but she said it never felt like a victory. Because for every inmate whose name was told, there were dozens who were buried without one. Marina's disappearance remains unsolved. Her last digital footprint was a message sent to a private email at 2:18 a.m. "If anything happens to me, the truth is already out." No one heard from her again. But the files she leaked remain online, unedited, raw, and chilling. Even the guards couldn't escape the echo. Some resigned. Others spoke out. One former officer, now working security at a shopping mall, said during an interview, "We thought we ran that place. But in the end, Rikers ran us." It changed everyone who walked through those gates, inmates and officers alike. The government released reports, commissions, and endless plans to ensure this never happens again. But in quieter prisons across the country, the same patterns reappeared: overcrowding, neglect, cover-ups. Different walls, same silence. And that's when the public began to realize something painful. Rikers wasn't just an island. It was a reflection of a system built to punish, not to change. And no demolition could erase that truth. One day, years after the closure, a group of filmmakers visited the island with permission to shoot a follow-up documentary. They walked through the remains of the intake unit, the same one where Tone first arrived as a teenager. The air was thick and cold. Someone found a scratched message on the back of a cell door. Still here. They filmed it, unsure who wrote it or when. But when the footage aired, viewers felt chills. Because deep down, everyone knew what it meant. Places like Rikers don't disappear, they linger, waiting to be remembered. At night, the island is pitch black, except for the distant glow of the city skyline. The lights of Manhattan shimmer like another world, separated by just a few miles of water, yet divided by centuries of pain. Sometimes, fishermen on the river say they hear faint sounds coming from the island. A door slamming, a voice calling out, or the echo of chains. Maybe it's the wind. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the memory of those who refuse to stay silent. Because no matter how many walls fall, how many names fade, the truth still whispers from that forgotten place. The same truth tone carved into his soul before he vanished. They're listening. So make sure they hear everything. The legacy of silence. The closure of Rikers Island wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning of the reckoning. What came next wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet. A quiet that haunted courtrooms, classrooms, and newsrooms across the nation. For years, people thought Rikers was an isolated nightmare, a single failure in an otherwise working system. But the evidence that came out proved otherwise. The brutality wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of silence, of people looking away because it was easier not to know. That silence had a cost, and now America was paying it. After the leaks, several states began investigating their own facilities. What they found mirrored the same cycle: overcrowding, cover-ups, and hopelessness repeating under new names. It wasn't just Rikers. It was everywhere. Advocates started calling it the Rikers effect. Documentaries, podcasts, and lectures across the US, Canada, and the UK began to use Rikers as a warning, a case study in what happens when punishment replaces rehabilitation. Colleges introduced courses called The Island Within the System. Students listened to the audio recordings of guards laughing while inmates begged for help, and you could see the shock in their eyes. The more they learned, the more they realized. Rikers was never a secret, it was a symptom. Tone's story became part of that lesson. His words, "Tell them the truth," were painted on protest banners and printed on shirts worn at rallies. But for those who had lived it, the memories were heavier than slogans. One former inmate, now a youth counselor, described what the silence did to people. It wasn't just the beatings. It was being treated like you don't exist. That kind of silence eats you alive. He now works with kids in the Bronx, teaching them about choices, consequences, and survival. Every time he looks at their faces, he sees echoes of the scared teenager he once was. And the journalist, she kept her promise. She visited schools, prisons, and community centers, telling the story again and again. Not for fame, not for fear, but because she believed that remembering was the only way to stop it from happening again. Still, the scars ran deep. Many guards who worked at Rikers struggled with guilt and trauma. Some couldn't sleep without hearing the alarms in their heads. Others refused to talk about it at all, carrying the weight silently into old age. A retired officer once said in a recorded interview, "The day they shut that place down, I thought I'd feel free." But the truth is, Rikers never leaves you. It follows you home. And for the families of those who never made it out, the closure changed nothing. They still visit graves, still hold photos, still whisper names into the wind, hoping someone's listening. Years later, when a new mayor proposed building a memorial on the island, people were divided. Some wanted it erased completely, turned into green space. Others demanded the ruins stay, untouched, as a reminder. In the end, they built nothing. The island remains empty, half reclaimed by nature, half frozen in time. The silence there is its own monument, a heavy, invisible one that needs no plaque to be understood. When you stand on the edge of the East River and look across at that quiet land, you can almost hear it breathing, a place that watched too much, took too much, and finally collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. They say if you visit on a still night, when the city noise dies down, you might hear faint whispers carried by the wind. Not ghosts, not echoes, but memories refusing to be buried. The voices of those who lived it. The ones who suffered it. The ones who told the truth, even when it cost them everything. And somewhere, in that darkness, the same 4 words are still written on the wall, faded, but not forgotten. Tell them the truth. The Forgotten Files. Years after Rikers Island shut down, most believed its story was complete, sealed away in archives and documentaries. But deep in a forgotten government storage facility in Brooklyn, the real ending was still waiting to be discovered. It started with a routine audit, a young clerk named Evan Ross, assigned to catalog old evidence boxes. He wasn't looking for secrets. He was just trying to finish his shift. But in the back of the dusty warehouse, buried under faded labels marked Archived, Do Not Open, he found a crate that didn't belong. The tag read, Property of New York Dock, Rikers, Confidential. Inside he found 3 sealed envelopes, a flash drive, and a small handheld recorder covered in dust. The first envelope contained old disciplinary reports, all with the same names stamped across the top. Anthony Tone Williams. The second contained photos, grainy stills from security cameras showing guards dragging an inmate through a hallway with no timestamp. And the third, a letter written in shaky handwriting. If you're reading this, it means they couldn't bury everything. My name is Marina Lopez. And this is the truth they tried to erase. Evan hesitated before plugging in the flash drive. When he finally did, his screen lit up with folders, hundreds of them, labeled by date, block, and event. The audio files were worse than anything he'd expected. Screams, guards threatening silence, and then Tone's voice. He wasn't shouting this time. He was calm, almost resigned. They moved me again. Said it's for my own safety. But I know what's coming. If anyone finds this, don't let them rewrite it again. Don't let them call this justice. The recording ended with a faint echo, a knock, then static. Evans sat frozen. He knew what he'd found could cost him his job, maybe more. But he also knew he couldn't walk away. He reached out to the same journalist who once broke the original Rikers story. When she answered, her voice trembled. She thought she'd heard the last of it years ago. And when Evan told her about the flash drive and the letters signed Marina, she whispered, then she never disappeared. Together, they began piecing it all back together. The recordings revealed that Tone was never transferred upstate. He was kept inside a hidden unit, a section of Rikers labeled C-13B, long before the official shutdown. No public records mentioned it. No blueprints showed it. But the files made it clear, it existed. C-13B was where problem inmates were sent, whistleblowers, informants, anyone who tried to expose the system. Guards called it the freezer. No cameras. No witnesses. No return. And in one of the final logs, dated just 2 days before the island's official evacuation, a single line appeared under Inmate Status, Williams. Transferred, location sealed. No signature. No timestamp. Just silence. The journalist published the findings in a report titled The Forgotten Files of Rikers Island. It spread like wildfire, reigniting outrage, reopening investigations, and shattering the illusion that justice had already been served. People wanted to know, who ordered the hidden transfers? Where were those inmates taken? And how many never made it out? Within weeks, federal agencies were forced to respond. Excavations began under the old Rikers compound, beneath the rubble where the C block once stood. And what they found would haunt the city forever. Behind a reinforced steel door sealed with welding marks, investigators uncovered a small, soundproof chamber. 6 by 10 feet, no windows, a single chair bolted to the floor. On the wall, faint but still visible, were the same 4 words. Tell them the truth. The discovery confirmed what survivors had whispered for years. Tone never escaped. He was silenced beneath the same walls he tried to expose. But his words, his message, had outlived every lock and chain. As reporters gathered outside the excavation site, the journalist who had carried his story for over a decade stood before the cameras and said, "He didn't die for nothing. The truth he left behind will outlive Rikers itself." Today, those recordings are preserved in a digital archive open to the public. labeled the Tone Williams Collection. They're played in classrooms, museums, and human rights seminars as living proof of what happens when power goes unchecked. The story of Rikers Island didn't end with its demolition. It ended here, in a warehouse, in a dusty box, discovered by accident. Because even when buried, the truth waits. And as long as someone listens, the silence can never win. The return of the truth. The discovery of the hidden chamber beneath Rikers Island sent shockwaves far beyond New York. What began as one man's cry for justice had become a national awakening, a mirror held up to a system that thrived in darkness. The journalist and Evan worked night after night, combing through the last pieces of Marina's files. Among them, they found a final folder, encrypted, unnamed, locked with a phrase. The password took days to guess. When they finally cracked it, one line appeared on the screen. "You found it. Now finish what we started." Inside were detailed emails, financial records, and internal memos linking senior city officials, police unions, and private contractors to years of corruption. Bribes, falsified reports, and hush payments to silence anyone who spoke out about Rikers. It wasn't just a prison. It was a business. Pain had been turned into profit, and every scream that echoed through those halls had been worth something on paper. The files went public. Lawsuits erupted. Politicians resigned. And across the country, people began to look differently at every concrete wall and razor wire fence that claimed to hold justice inside. For the journalist, it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. She said in her final interview, "We can't undo what happened on that island, but we can make sure no one ever says they didn't know." Tone's voice, pulled from his last recording, became the closing line of her final documentary. "They built walls to hide us, but those same walls ended up telling our story." The screen faded to black. Black circle epilogue, the truth that lives on. Today, Rikers Island is nothing more than ruins surrounded by still water. Nature has begun to reclaim it, grass creeping through concrete, seagulls nesting in the towers. But even as the island sinks slowly back into the earth, its story lives on. Schools teach about it. Filmmakers still visit its remains. And in prisons across America, inmates whisper Tone's name, not as a legend, but as a warning. Because Rikers was never just about one place. It was about what happens when silence becomes normal, when power goes unchecked, when human suffering is hidden behind the word correction. The island fell. The truth rose. And now, it belongs to everyone who refuses to look away. As the final scene fades, the voice of Tone echoes one last time, steady, defiant, eternal. You can cage a man. You can bury his voice. But you can't bury the truth. Music swells, a low, haunting piano slowly rising into light. The screen fades to black and a final line appears, dedicated to every soul silenced behind the walls, and to those still brave enough to listen. Every great story ends with a truth that outlives the people who told it. Rikers Island may be gone, but its echo is everywhere. In the fight for justice, in the push for reform, in every voice that refuses to be silenced. This isn't just history. It's a warning. Because the next Rikers could be anywhere, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to speak. And if Tone's story teaches us anything, it's that silence doesn't protect the powerful, it exposes them. The truth always finds a way out.